Hey, it's Mr. Spencer. We're talking about Chapter 8 of The Great Gatsby, summarizing. I love this book. The last two chapters get very heavy. So don't fall down with all the heaviness that we're going over here. All right, Chapter 8. In Great Gatsby, Chapter 8, things go from bad to much, much worse after Myrtle's death. Hit and run. There's a mournful and melancholy tone to half of the story in Chapter 8 as Nick tells us about Gatsby giving up on his dreams of Daisy and reminiscing about his time with her 5 years before in 1917. The other half of the chapter is all police thriller as we hear Machalis, the Greek cafe owner, describe Wilson coming unglued and deciding to take bloody revenge for Myrtle's death. That night, Nick has trouble sleeping as we start Chapter 8. He feels like he needs to warn Gatsby about something. When he meets up with Gatsby at dawn, Gatsby tells Nick nothing happened outside Daisy's house all night. Was Gatsby up all night? They had the big confrontation in the hotel in Chapter 7, the fight with Tom, the automobile accident. Gatsby's been up all night, and his house feels strangely enormous. It's also poorly kept, dusty, unaired, and unusually dark, Nick notices. Nick advises Gatsby to lay low on the DL somewhere else so that his car isn't found and linked to the accident. Nick's standing up for Gatsby or trying to help him hide the fact of this murder, hit and run, accidental manslaughter. But Gatsby's unwilling to leave his lingering hopes for Daisy. Instead, Gatsby tells Nick about his background, the information that Nick told us in Chapter 6, but we expand on it a little further here. Gatsby's narrative begins with the description of Daisy as the first wealthy upper-class girl Gatsby had ever met. It appears that Gatsby takes over the point of view here. It's a little unclear and ambiguous, though. Gatsby loved her huge, beautiful house and the fact that many men had loved her before him. All of this made him see her as a prize. He knew that since he was poor, he shouldn't really have been wooing her, but he slept with her anyway, under the false pretenses that he and she were in the same social class. But Gatsby realized that he was in love with Daisy and was surprised to see that Daisy fell in love with him too. They were together for a month before Gatsby had to leave for the war in Europe. He was successful in the army, becoming a major. But after the war ended, he ended up at Oxford, unable to return to Daisy. Okay, on page 150 and 151, you gotta read it. It is some of the most beautiful language that's ever been written in the English language. Meanwhile, Daisy re-entered the normal rhythm of life on page 151. Lavish living, snobbery, lots of dates, and all-night parties. For, quote, page 151, Daisy was young and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. Page 151, you gotta check it out. Seriously, look at it. It's beautiful. Gatsby sensed from her letters that she was annoyed at having to wait for him and instead wanted to finalize what her life would be like. The person who finalized her life in a practical way that made sense was Tom. Gatsby interrupts his narrative again to say that there's no way Daisy ever loved Tom. Well, maybe for a second, right after the wedding, tops, but that's it. Gatsby's narrative goes back to his story, which concludes after Daisy's wedding to Tom, when Gatsby came back from Oxford. Daisy and Tom were still on their honeymoon. Gatsby felt like that the best thing in his life had disappeared forever. After breakfast, Gatsby's gardener suggests draining the pool, but Gatsby wants to keep it filled since he hasn't used it yet all summer. Gatsby still hopes that Daisy will call him. Next part of Chapter 8, Nick thanks Gatsby for the hospitality, pays him for the backhanded compliment of saying that he's better than the rotten crowd of upper-class people. It's a backhanded compliment because it's setting the bar pretty low to be better than rotten people. And he leaves to go to work. At work, Nick gets a phone call from Jordan, who's upset that Nick didn't pay sufficient attention to her the night before. Nick is floored by such selfishness. After all, someone died. So how could Jordan be so self-involved? They hang up on each other, clearly broken up. Nick tries to call Gatsby, but is told by the operator that the line is being kept free for a phone call from Detroit, which might actually be Gatsby's way of clearing the line in case Daisy calls. It's unclear. They don't have call waiting back then. On the way back from the city, Nick purposefully sits on the side of the train car that won't face Wilson's garage. He can't even look at the scene of the accident. Nick tells us that what happened at the garage after he, Tom, and Jordan drove away the day before. Since he wasn't there, he's most likely recapping Michalis's inquest statement, maybe taking details from the investigation. They found Myrtle's sister apparently too drunk to understand what had happened to Myrtle. Remember Catherine in chapter 2? Then she fainted and she had to be taken away. Michalis sat with Wilson until dawn, listening to Wilson talk about the yellow car that had run Myrtle over and how to find it. Michalis suggested that Wilson talk to a priest, but Wilson showed Michalis an expensive dog leash that he found. Remember the B word in chapter 2? To him, this was incontrovertible proof of her affair and the fact that her lover killed Myrtle on purpose. Wilson said that Myrtle was trying to run out to talk to the man in the yellow car, while Michalis believed that she had been trying to flee the house where Wilson had locked her up. Wilson had told Myrtle that God could see everything she was doing. The God he's talking about? Well, it might be the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg near the garage. Wilson seemed calm, so Michalis went home to sleep. By the time he came back to the garage, Wilson was gone. Wilson walked all the way to West Egg, asking about the yellow car. And who's looking over? The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. So what happens at the end of chapter 8? That afternoon, Gatsby gets in the pool for the first time that summer. He's still waiting for a call from Daisy. Nick tries to imagine what it must have been like to be Gatsby and know that your dream was lost. Notice also Gatsby stayed up all night lurking outside Tom and Daisy's house. Gatsby's chauffeur hears gunshots just as Nick pulls up to the house. In the pool, they see Gatsby's dead body, and a little way off in the grass, they see Wilson's body. Quote from page 162. It was after we started with Gatsby toward the house, Gatsby's body, that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. Wilson has shot Gatsby and then himself. We move chapter 9 in the next video. Are you ready for this? What's going to happen in the last chapter of The Great Gatsby? This has been Mr. Spencer, signing off.